Complex black armor. It's one of our favorite topics of conversation on this channel, how to produce the perfect black armor for your miniatures. In this video, we'll be looking at how to create a complex black sheen that is deep and lustrous, and we'll also look at the differences between this and, I guess, human armor, ceramite. To begin, we start with a pre-coat. So on top of a black undercoated miniature, in this case I've used the Scale 75 black primer through the airbrush. I've allowed to dry, I've hit it with a hairdryer to allow it to cure a lot faster. I'm using Medea Com Art Opaque White. This is my favourite white to run through the airbrush, and it is well worth the effort of trying to secure some. I know that some students in North America have had issues in finding it. There are depots in New York, I believe. Hopefully this should be available. Alternatively, the Scale 75 Art White airbrushes beautifully. However, so for this stage, I'm able to sketch out the basic volumes and values of the piece, so it gives me a greater idea of exactly where I want to place my highlights, what I want to do with the miniature, what areas of the armour I want to develop. At this stage, it's always a good idea to highlight the head a little bit brighter than the rest of the miniature to give us a sense of focus, to draw the eye towards that point. Next up, in order to refine this, I'm using Scale 75's Ink Tensity Black ink, and this is thinned down 2 parts ink to 1 part thinner, and I'm simply resketching the shadows in order to give me a little bit more of a leg up to blend the armour a little bit more before I go into the brush painting stages. Now, the pre-coat should only be thought of as a glorified base coat. You are able to achieve a remarkably similar thing by simply taking an aerosol can and spraying it at a 45-degree angle above the miniature as a zenithal highlight. So a zenithal highlight simply means lighting from above. Okay, here is the palette. So these are the colours I want to use for the armour, and you can see it's a wider range array between dark blue, dark navy blue, in this case Prussian blue, and light pastels, both warm pastels and cool pastels. If we look at this image in front of us, we can see how we have the blue reflection sitting on the top portions of the armour, and if you look underneath his legs on the inside of his thighs, we have a purple reflection. So it's a take on sky earth metal, where the turquoise reflects from above and the earth reflects from below. But because this armour is so rich and deep and lustrous, the brown that normally is reflected on sky earth metals is instead turned into purple. Okay, so here's how I arrange my palette. We have turquoise blue at the very bottom, off-white, white, black. No, Arctic blue. There you go, black. Then we have grey-green, Prussian blue, which is an incredibly dark blue that you can see. I'm just going through all the colours I've used. So along that spectrum we have most of the colours for the armour, apart from the magenta, which we will be adding in one moment. Okay. So that's the colour spectrum of the top portion of the armour, and now I have my modulating colours. Whenever you develop a palette, or whenever you put colours on the palette, always have primary yellow, primary blue, primary red, and magenta. It's always a good idea to include turquoise, black and white as well. Between these tones, between these colours, we're able to mix up a wider range of colours and modulate any other colours that we do put on our palette. Deep purple is being put on there, and between these colours we should get most of the tones needed for the black armour. But if you don't use the Scale 75 artist set, no need to worry, you don't need to. So Prussian blue is deep blue by Scale 75, and I think it's also deep blue in the Vallejo range. Please don't worry about the actual paint manufacturer. Instead, look at the actual colour itself and match it. There are resources, especially on Daka Daka, where you're able to put in Scale 75 deep blue, for example, or Prussian blue, and it'll give you equivalents across the paint ranges. What is more important is that you visually realize what color you're seeing in front of you and the underlying theory that goes into the creation of the armor. So to begin with, we are using a cool color in terms of the blue, so we're using Prussian blue mixed up with a pinch of black for contrast, and this has been thinned down 1 part paint to 2 to 3 parts thinner, in this case water, and I'm overlapping this on top of the lighter portions of the armor that would sit in more direct sunlight. Magenta plus black is also thinned down 1 part paint to 2 to 3 parts thinner and glazed on the inside of the leg where we have any bounce reflections. A bounce reflection is where light comes from above, hits the armor, hits the surrounding surface of the miniature and reflects back onto the underside of the armor, or bounces back up to create some rather unusual and interesting focal points for your miniature. So at this stage, it's very loose, it's very sketchy. I'm getting a feel of the volumes of the miniature, the actual sculpt itself. I guess I'm building up a little bit of muscle memory. When you attempt something like this, it's nerve-wracking. You might not be sure where you want to head with it, how you want to develop it. So the pre-shade breaks down the fear factor, and this glaze stage breaks it down even further. But I know through color theory that in order to give myself a deep, interesting, lustrous black, I will need to overlap cool tones and warm tones. The perfect example here, we have Arctic blue, which is a light, sort of a space wolf blue. And we also have off-white, which has more of a yellow undertone to it. I've mixed these together, primarily Arctic blue, white, and off-white, so it lies somewhere 70% Arctic, actually a bit more than that, 90% Arctic blue, and then 5% white and off-white, to give me this sort of off creamy colour. Now if I wanted it cooler, I'd add more Arctic blue. If I wanted it warmer, I'd add more off-white. But for this initial sketch, for this initial layer, I do want it veering on the cool side of things a little bit more. And at this stage, I'm merely sketching out the reflection points on the armor. I'm trying to be as neat and as precise as I possibly can be. Adding an edge highlight helps focus the lines of reflections that we will build up, and again builds confidence, it builds muscle memory. And you'll notice the way I maneuver the brush, how it's all in context, how it's all in the same movement. I don't drag the brush up and down, it all slides across the armor plate to develop that sense of texture, as if light is hitting the surface and it's kind of making a zigzag motion over those plain armored plates. At this stage, I'm not too concerned with the actual pigmentation, the coloration of it. I'm developing the volumes and the values, so that scale from light to dark, and the volumes, so the shapes on the miniature. Okay, let's go in with a little bit of magenta plus black plus off-white. I'll sketch the inside of the thigh. Now this video will be broken up into several parts. We'll concentrate on developing the thigh armor plate to begin with, to completion, which you should be able to go on and create your own. And then we'll look at the focal points of the miniature, the head, shoulder guard, and we'll also be running you through the other leg as well, and how to create these reflection points. What is important from these video tutorial series is that you do not copy these exactly. Instead, sorry, I should probably clarify that. I'd love you to copy this directly. However, what's more important is that you take away the underlying theory and dynamically apply it to your own work. So what are we doing here? Well, we are adding a warm highlight to magenta, which is considered to be a cool color. However, when you look at magenta, in fact, when you look at most colours, you can say that there are two versions of them. Magenta, you can either have a cooler magenta, which veers more towards the blue side of the spectrum, or a warmer magenta, which veers more towards the orange-yellow side of the spectrum. In this case, because we have a very cool highlight sitting on the top armor plate, which is dominated by Prussian blue, turquoise, Arctic blue, I've decided to use a little bit of off-white in the shadows to highlight them, but not highlight them to the same degree as that top, the top armor plate. Okay, I've moved down a brush size. I believe I'm on the 00 Winsor Newton at this point because I need absolute precision. All the paint at this point is rather undiluted. It's building layers of paint one on top of another. I'm using soft brush strokes. So consistency of paint is important to keep in mind. However, what's also important as well is the amount of moisture that's in your brush and the pressure on which you apply the colour. The softer the sweep, the softer the highlight. And we're able to create these beautifully blended effects, these soft transitions, even with base coat thickness of paint. In this case, very, very light movements, light pressure made with the tip of the brush creates that soft transition. Now, this video series is very much labelled as a masterclass, and this is the reason why, because we are considering so much in our working process right here. We are not only considering the colour itself we want to express, black, but we're also considering the context in which we find it. So it's a dark elder miniature, it's nobility. This is a mythical creature we are trying to paint here. We want to overlap warm and cool tones to develop highlights. We want to have secondary bounce reflections because the armor has such a polished sheen to it that it will reflect the ambient surroundings. It won't just reflect the immediate. When we look at ceramite, for example, because that's an imperfect structure, it won't be as deep or lustrous as this tone, so there won't be as many color nuances to it. We'll go up the grayscale, so we'll start at black and use various shades of grey to highlight it, maybe with a touch of blue here and there, but that will pretty much be it. With this piece, instead, we want to lay down a foundation of cool colour and then use warm to highlight it. In fact, it might be worth, if you have it, grab your colour wheel and have it alongside our discussion here. Okay, so now I've built the structure. I'm feeling reasonably comfortable with where the reflections sit in relation to one another. I'm now using glazes to help soften and deepen the tone. Prussian blue and a pinch of black, just the very barest pinch of black, is added to the shadows of the armor. There is a lot more moisture loaded up into the brush and a lot more moisture loaded up into the paint. So we're looking 1 part paint to 5 to 6 parts thinner, and the movements of the brush are painfully precise. Do not try this when you've had a bunch of coffee, when you've had a lot, or you've had a stressful day. And we are moving the paintbrush. First of all, we're defining the armor plates, so we're defining the very definitive streaks in between them, and then we'll be finagling, we'll be kind of shifting the shadows and highlights around. And okay, perfectly on cue. So I've started to add a little bit of yellow and turquoise. So that's blue-green. And this is again a glaze-like consistency. And I'm glazing this to connect those top thigh plates to the top highlight. Why am I using yellow? Okay, stop the video here, grab a color wheel, come back. Okay, last week at time of recording, I released a video on gemstones where I talked a little bit about chromatic value on color. all colour naturally appears brighter or darker than one another. So when you take blue, for example, navy blue, that naturally appears darker than yellow or bright primary yellow because we can say it is a lower chromatic value. So chroma simply means the colour and value means that scale from black to white. When highlighting colours, especially rich backgrounds like this, try and add a pinch of yellow in there as well. It knocks off chalkiness and it creates a much more satisfying, deepened tone to the armour. And when you look at this image, when you look at it complete, you'd never guess that there were notes of yellow in there. However, we can dynamically and use the colour wheel in a very interesting fashion here to highlight the armour plate with yellow to give it a deeper lustrous appearance. This is something that we can certainly do with Space Marine armour. However, we might want to mix it with a significant amount of light grey so it doesn't look this reflective. If you were interested in learning more about colour theory, there is one PDF that was released last year. Please get in touch, I can send it through to you. More are being developed, but gauging audience is always something whether... because this is very much aimed as a masterclass, it requires patient study. And if this isn't popular, well, we'll look at something else to do. If it is popular, if it does get good response, if you request more of this stuff, then we'll do more of these sorts of masterclass videos. But alongside this, we are releasing a free-to-view video on YouTube. The Art of Compromise, trying to get your Dark Elder painted with color shift paints, and that feels very much like the polar opposite of what this video is. This video, you have to develop quite a lot of technique, and you build up to this. This is us flexing right now. There's a lot of complex techniques, theory that goes into the creation of this armor. However, if you want to paint an army, get some color shift paint, spray your miniatures, boom. That's half the battle right there. Alright, I've added a pinch of white to off-white to really cement those top highlights. You can see after several layers of glazing how those transitions have softened. Where we have gained in transition, unfortunately we've lost in grit, in just texture. So we'll be moving between layering and glazing to try and find that perfect midpoint between the two, between that perfect point of interest and blending. So having the 00 brush really does help in these scenarios. And there you go. So the off-white does have a small amount of yellow. So when you want to create off-white, it's white with a pinch of yellow and a pinch of black to create it. So we can say we are highlighting a cool color with a warm tone to give maximum contrast. I wonder if the microphone just picked up on those seagulls. Okay, we add another layer. So this is quite a soft movement with the brush. Okay, that's pretty much the outer armor done at this point. For the inner portion of the armor, we are glazing deep purple from the mid-tone into the shadow. Then we're adding a very light, soft glaze layer over the highlights. So we want to locate our colour first in those shadows and then pull it over the highlight. Why? Well, we want the darker shadows to remain in the shadows. Before this is dried, I've taken a pinch of off-white. I've added it to the magenta formula, so the magenta tone that we made earlier with black, magenta and white. Well, we've added a pinch of that to help, and as the paint was drying, I added a little bit of a wet blend. It's cheeky, I know, because we're straying away from the overlapping glazing and layering, and we're also introducing a third element. So we're layering the colour first, then we're glazing it, and before that glaze dries, we're adding a pinch of highlight to wet blend it at the same time. When filming these videos, it's quite, the masterclasses especially, because it's quite hard to narrate what I'm doing at the time. It's a very unnatural thing to do, because I've grown up, everybody grows up painting. We don't narrate what we are painting. We don't consciously think about what we're about to do before we do it. Well, I certainly don't. I feel my way through a project. So when it does come to the masterclasses, I've been trying to think of a way to pitch the idea of how you do, how exactly do you give a tutorial on serendipity? How some brushstrokes just seem to come out of nowhere. They're a form that just develop out of that instinct at that time. How do I train you to do that? Time, experience, time in the chair, tuition will help a great deal. Watching this video, now instead of watching this video, actually studying up until this point in the video will help, well, I hope it will help your miniature painting dramatically. So it might be worth stopping the video at this point, rewinding it, taking notes, because this sort of process that we go through develops you as a miniature painter. It develops you beyond a like a rank and file, an army painter. These are the kind of styles, these are the kind of techniques that, dare I say it, start to edge into art, where it's a consideration of the brushstroke, of context, and painting the miniature is a bit like reading a really good book. You settle in and you just forget who you are, you forget your troubles, and you just let the brushwork do the job for you. It does the thinking for you at times. But how on earth do I translate that into a tutorial? How on earth do I say rely on serendipity? Hopefully I'm not mangling the job too much. Okay, now we develop a little bit of the shadows again, using Prussian blue plus a pinch of black. And to finally highlight it, we've got a pinch of off-white with a touch of white added. We are very carefully reinforcing what we've just done. We've built up the structure, we've built up the volumes, the values. The hue is looking good. It's just minor shifts in tone to refine it. So very thin glazes. Popped here and there. And the same with the underside of the armor plate. So instead of using Prussian blue to shade it, we've added magenta plus black instead. Also add a little bit of I hate myself when I do this, but I'm trying to explain one technique and then I'll jump into another. So with this, I'm adding a little bit of wet blending using the magenta and the white mix. Okay, and with that, the thigh is done. It might be worth at this point just stopping the video, reviewing it, going back, seeing what we've done, take notes. However, if you are ready to plow on, then plow we shall. Okay, so the top of the head. I've mixed up this neon green looking colour. How on earth did I do this? Well, it's turquoise blue with a pinch of white and a pinch of primary yellow. Why have I gone this luminous yellow? Well, I want a brighter value overall to the face. I want the face to look brighter. Why is this? Well, when we have brighter faces, it naturally draws our eye to them. When we look at this sculpt with the horns, with the plume, the pattern recognition that we have may not immediately recognize this as a humanoid shape. You might struggle to locate where the eyes actually are and where the feature points of the miniature are. So a cool little trick is to highlight the head a little bit more. And in that way, we can drag our attention. We can signal to the viewer, this is where you should be looking. We could do all the same tricks. So the purple sits as the bounce reflection. And the turquoise sits in the highlight. A thin glaze of Prussian blue plus black is applied over the highlighted areas of the face. And you'll notice that I'm dragging the brush down into those shadows. Movement of the brush is so important to develop a correct scheme. In this case, I'm dragging the shadows down to the, into the shadows. And for the highlight, I'm manipulating my brush upwards. So I'm pushing all the pigment where I want it to sit. If you were looking for a colour equivalent for this, if you didn't want to mix and match this, Cabalite Green from Games Workshop would be an excellent choice. Because it's a light mint green that veers more towards the blue side of the spectrum. Again, harkening back to... Harkening? Don't think I've ever used that word in an actual sentence, in a serious sentence. But, yeah, let's go with it. Harkening back to our earlier discussion on colour theory. How some colours have a chromatic value assigned to them. The yellow goes in the top highlight and contrasts with the cool, with the cool tones of the blue. We can also look at green itself. Okay, so let's have a look at green on your colour wheel. Look how some of it veers more towards like a spring green, a yellow green. So we can say that green has a warm composite to it, and then when we veer the other way towards blue, we can also say that green has a cool complement to it. So we can have warm greens and cool greens, even though the colour itself is considered in its entirety to be cool. If you do have a colour wheel, you should be able to see, it should mark out for you what are warm and cool colours. Okay, let's have a look at the shoulder guard, shall we? So we have turquoise blue with a pinch of black added to it, and that's glazed, so we're looking 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. That's glazed onto the shoulder guard, and before it dries, I'm taking a pinch of my yellow green. So this is turquoise blue plus yellow plus white, the majority of it being white. Alternatively, we can use a Cyberite green. We very carefully add undiluted paint into the paint that's been added to the surface. And as it starts to dry, the paint starts to spread out ever so slightly, and it gives us that wonderfully blended appearance. Very quick, very simple, very easy way to... Well, easy if you spend hours and hours and hours of practicing. Okay, with the tip of the brush, I'm just carefully manipulating it, pulling that pigment from the off-white into the very top areas of the highlight on the top of the head. So it almost looks pure white, but it's not. We know that because, well, hopefully you've been watching the video, you've been listening to what the hell I've been saying. Gently drag that down. And look at that, we have that cool nuance with that warm highlight. Oh, beautiful. Okay, let's reinforce this shoulder guard, shall we? Okay, we're dragging off-white as an edge highlight. Then we can reinforce that by gently feathering it along that line. Okay, a few touches here and there just to reinforce the highlight. See, I've made a little bit of a mistake there, so I've cleaned off my brush. I've gently removed the excess paint. So at this stage of the face, I have the structure in place. The hues are looking good. It's more about refinement at this stage. So I'll be overlapping layering techniques and glazing techniques in order to deepen the armor and help with the structure. So layering helps add complexity to the piece, whereas glazing adds nuance and depth to the piece, whereas layering adds structure. On the other side, we add more purple into the mixture. You can see the difference it makes just adding that small amount of yellow. and you may not necessarily detect it immediately. It's one of those things that you get better at detecting the more you do it, like tasting wine, I guess. The more you drink, the more flavor notes you can detect. Okay, let's return back to the shoulder guard, where we're adding depth to the armor by adding a glaze of turquoise plus black. And before that dries, I can wet blend a little bit of the off-white. You're detecting a theme now. You're detecting how I do things. And if you do take on this challenge, if you do paint this miniature using this guide, please get in touch. It's one of my wishes to see more students challenge themselves with things like this. Contact me via Facebook, contact me via Instagram, and I could give you a little bit more guidance, individualized guidance on this, because I'm desperate to see what these sorts of videos do in the wild. Okay, let's add a secondary bounce reflection. So this is a toughie, I gotta admit. Okay, so you've added, I have added the magenta mix as a glaze to that secondary reflection point, and now I'm adding the light turquoise plus off-white to it to wet blend it in. So to I guess reiterate, to go over what we've done previously. So we are not only overlapping warm and cool tones, we are not only contrasting turquoise next to the magenta, but we're also building in complex reflection points on something like that armor plate, using overlapping magenta plus turquoise plus the ice yellow, plus the off-white. I hope I'm not making this sound too complex, because I'm simply wet blending at this point. And a wet blend is created by applying a wet layer of paint on first, and taking undiluted paint that is quite thick and applying it onto the drying surface of the miniature. I do have a tendency to over-explain things. Mute me and watch the video. It might... Oh god, that's a depressing thought. It might give you a clearer idea of what to do. Oh god. Instead of me just tongue-tying myself and wrapping things up in riddles. Talking about volumes and values and nonsense. Okay, for the rest of the armor plates, so that is the examples I wanted to show you done at this point. From here, the video until... where are we? Until 58 minutes 45-ish seconds. We'll concentrate on developing the armor plates. It's exactly the same process we've been through previously, overlapping warm and cool tones. At 58 minutes, we'll dive into the non-metallic blades. So if you feel like you've learnt as much as you can, or you've taken on the theory, stop at this point, move on to 58 minutes. If you wanted to watch brushstroke per brushstroke, I'll leave you in the very capable hands of my background music. How many of you skipped ahead? Huh? Oh no. Okay, non-metallic blades. What on earth am I doing? Well, magenta goes on first as a thin glaze layer, so we're looking 2 parts paint, 1 part thinner across the entire thing. You should still be able to see the underlying layer of the pre-coat. Before this fully dries, we take turquoise blue from Scale 75 Artist. You can also use blue-green from Vallejo, model color, or Adriatic blue from Scale 75. And we are wet blending this. Now, it's a good idea not to use your best brush, so I'm using a Redgrass Games brush right here. It came to a very fine point, but due to hard wearing, it doesn't come to a fine point anymore. And I'm feathering. So feathering simply is another word for blending. I'm blending the turquoise blue from the highlight through to the lower mid-tone. Now as this dries a little bit more, I can add a bit more turquoise blue in here. What on earth am I doing? What on earth am I doing? Well, this is a rather unusual way to paint non-metallic silver, where we apply very strong, vibrant colours into the base of the blade, and then we overlap this with a light pastel colour. So this retains the inner sheen, the shine, those unusual complex patterns that do develop on non-metallic metal. But we're also able to glaze over the top to neutralise it. It's one of these, a bit like painting faces, it's one of these bizarre skills or bizarre paint recipes that shouldn't work until you try it, and it does. And who knew? Well, I knew, that's who. That's what I'm trying to teach you. And after the turquoise, yellow, of course. Yeah, why on earth wouldn't I use yellow? So this is a much thinner version of what we've been doing so far. It's a glaze-like consistency. We're looking at 1 part paint, 4 to 5 parts thinner, and we're glazing this over any highlight. So it pretty much covers the turquoise. Okay, we can analyse this a little bit more deeply. So we're using the updated primary colours, magenta, turquoise, and yellow, to build the complex reflections in the blade. The magenta has been put on top of a black base coat. The turquoise covers the slightly higher tone, and then yellow occupies that very top highlight. Okay, a little bit of sanity. Here comes Off-White by Scale 75, and this is edge highlighted along the side of the blade. This is barely diluted, so we're looking at 3 parts paint, 1 part thinner. It's mainly the moisture that's kept in the brush that's allowing it to slip off so easily and so nicely onto the blade. I don't thin it down. I don't thin it down. It's just the natural moisture that sits in the number 2 brush, I believe I'm using, from Winsor & Newton, this Winsor & Newton Series 7 watercolour brushes. The first few movements with the brush are mainly to establish my top highlights and the edge highlights. So you can see how I'm moving the brush in context with the lines that I want to create on the piece. And even with a number 2 brush, I'm able to get some amazing accuracy developing the tones with pinpoint accuracy where I want them to be. And it is starting to look a little bit saner at this point. Okay, soft transitions at this point. So very little paint on the brush, soft movements with the tip of the brush, kind of dragging it along the highlighted portions. A little bit of paint goes in the brush, but it's again very soft, very little moisture in the bristles of the brush. I'm moving this in context with those lines I want to develop. Now, having a watercolor brush like this does help tremendously because the amount of water retention it has. Okay, weirdly enough, so these are the bristles of the hair, Klinsky sable hair, and this is a Siberian weasel, which has the fortune, or rather misfortune, to have the best water retention of any mass farmable animal that you can find. Phenomenal for miniature painting, not so great for the weasel. Okay, from here, it's soft movements with the brush, overlapping, gradually pulling away from that central mass that we created with our first brush strokes. And we are glazing this over not only the yellow, the turquoise, but as well as the magenta. And every single stroke, every single glaze, every single layer we add further desaturates the underlying hues that we built up. But we can still see that really nice reflective sheen, that shine, the complex shine that we have. It's a rather unusual way to paint non-metallic, I grant you, and it does require a little bit of practice. However, practice makes perfect. We all have to start somewhere. It's the same on the underside of the blades, where we have the turquoise, the magenta, the yellow. And then we apply the off-white over the top. Now once this is complete, we will add specular highlights of pure white. But perhaps you can repeat after me. Perhaps you can go through this. Okay, so what have we done here? We have used cool colors in the shadow, in the mid-tone, the highlight. The yellow has turned slightly greenish, and now we're using a warm color in the terms of the off-white to highlight it. Cool and warm. I should call this video cool and warm. Cool versus warm. Do you know what happens when a cool front meets a warm front? Tornadoes, I think. I'm not really too sure. Tornadoes happen, and that's what's happening here. We're making a tornado of color. From here, so we have the structure in place. It's refinement. Glazes of black plus magenta are being added into the shadows, and we can also add glazes of turquoise to those top to mid highlights. From here, it's glazing to help neutralize everything and build up those tones. All with off-white. So it's only the magenta, I guess black we've used. Black, magenta, off-white, yellow and turquoise. Those are the only colours that we need. But through our knowledge of colour theory, we're able to overlap them and create this rather unusual but effective non-metallic scheme. To finish off this rather bizarre this rather bizarre way of doing non-metallic metal, I have added a small amount of white into the off-white to add a specular highlight along the edges of the edges of the blade, as well as any other areas I feel could do with a little bit more attention drawn to it. And this is the blade as it appears in the photograph. So as you can see, you can see the turquoise, the purple, but it might not be immediately, you might not immediately register it when you see a photograph of it. Okay, let's have a look at the horns, shall we? A lot simpler process. So this is black plus a small amount of turquoise blue. Before that's dried, primary yellow plus turquoise, so we're looking 80% primary yellow, 20% turquoise, is wet blended over a rather broad area of the horns. Wet blending is phenomenal for giving very faint transitions across unusual areas like this. I mean, the horns are so hard to highlight because of the ridges. Once that's fully and utterly dried, we take primary yellow and we add off-white to it, and we edge highlight each and every one of these little raised areas. So I'm using a number 2 brush for this. As you can see, it comes to a nice fine point, even though the ends are a little bit frayed. So I'm being very careful just to pick out those top highlights. Really unify and really drag your attention to them. From here on out, I'm just refining those highlights, adding even more off-white into the mixture to highlight the top of the horns. The majority of the work is done with the wet blend, the transition between the black and the top yellowish highlights. And the pre-coat helps a hell of a lot. So even if this seems a little bit, I guess, easier in comparison to the rest of the things we've been doing, well, it's because we've laid down such strong foundations in terms of the wet blend and the initial pre-coat. We've just made our lives a lot easier on ourselves. Okay, and that is it for the horns. Let's have a look at the broken spirit stone, shall we? So we've given this a glaze of, let me check my notes, emerald green. And then we are using spring green from the Scale 75 artist set. So this is, in effect, Dark Angel's green as a base coat, and then a yellowish mook green, I think it's called, from Games Workshop, to highlight it. So these goes in the very top edges, the ridges of the broken spirit stones, and then we gradually increase the value, the highlight of it, by adding more ice. Well, adding a small amount of off-white. A small amount of deep purple is worked in between the gaps. I did want to suggest maybe like a blood or some kind of circulatory system And I just think the combination of the combination of green and purple is discordant. That's why the Joker wears it. So by adding a small amount of deep purple into those gaps, I not only suggest maybe like dried blood or some manner of the macabre, but also it feeds into the colour theory of this being a discordant race and a discordant creature. Final highlight of off-white is applied to the very top of the broken spirit stones to really sell that. It's called a specular highlight or a hot highlight. It's a very intense pinprick highlight applied to reflective surfaces to make them seem reflective. And there we have it, the final result. Drahzar in all his glory. Now with a miniature like this, it does look better on a black background because you can see the reflective sheen of the armour. Oh, incidentally, the base. This was a video that was filmed as part of the Advent Calendar release. It is available on the Patreon right now. So if you were curious, if you were waiting all this time for the base, well, it's already up. It's already there. This tutorial is a challenging one, no doubt about it. It's a masterclass. It's meant to challenge you as a painter. Instead of thinking of this in its entirety, break it down into smaller steps. Have a look at the thigh armor plate. Develop that on a miniature. Hell, paint this miniature using a brushstroke per brushstroke guide. I would love to see that. But when attempting projects on this scale, make sure that you break it down and make sure that each portion is manageable for you. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please let me know if you do try this on anything, and I'll catch you in the next video.